is that the people of this area, this immediate area, the Mid Falls, the Rock Streets, the Rodney area and the St James's area, were persecuted, brutalised and terrorised by British state forces and their surrogates. And this community paid a very severe price, a very high price, in terms of deaths and the loss of loved ones. And we will never forget that. And the young people in particular of this area will never forget that. So I would like to mention all of the people who lost their lives in this immediate area and think of their families and loved ones at this time. And today we're here to talk about James Carson, our good friend and a great person. James was from the Arizona from the Arizona area, Glen Road, and he was 32 years of age when he died in this shop a few yards from where I stand 30 years ago today. James was the son of Patsy and Charlie and the brother of Susan and Edward. James went to school in St Mary's Grammar School and then moved on to De La Salle College. And I would just like to give everybody a little bit of a sense of who James was, because he was a bit of a character. And our lives, from we all met James, was filled with fun and laughter. And that laughter ended a little bit when James died, but I just want to give everybody a sense to encapsulate of who James was, because a lot of the customers that visited our shop here, the old 7-Eleven, loved James and he loved them. And a lot of those older people that James spoke to and made friends with didn't realise that James was a bit of a rebel when he was a mid-teenager. When everybody had long hair down to their shoulders, James had long hair down to his waist. And James was never early for school. One of the teachers actually came down out of the school one morning to get him out of bed. And the boss of De La Salle College, if I could just tell this little story to give you all a sense of James. Brother Cornelius was feared by all. And after repeated warnings of James not turning up for school in time, he finally sent for him. And all of the school were whispering and saying, James has been sent for, he's in the boss's office. And a half an hour later, people couldn't understand why he still hadn't come out. 35 minutes later, the canteen ladies turned up with tea and scones. That was James. He turned round the boss, pulling him into the office, turned the meeting round to the boss falling in love with James and sending out for tea and scones. James was also a bass guitarist, loved music, loved Thin Lizzy, loved Phil Lynott, loved going to Ballyshannon to visit the statue of Phil Lynott. We were only there for the beer. James was there to visit the statue. He also loved the classics. None of us heard of Tchaikovsky or Beethoven until we met James. All of the people of Arizona Street knew the Tchaikovsky 1812 overture back to front. The neighbours used to call to the house when James returned home from work and ask could he just play it once. It was heard all over the street. And James introduced all of us to the classics. And when James organised a night out, we all turned up. Because whether he was bringing us to the Grand Opera House to see Swan Lake, or down to the Gaiety Theatre in Dublin to see O'Casey's Juno and the Paycock, we were always guaranteed a brilliant night. So no one questioned of what the event was going to be when we turned up. Such was the love we had for him. James was very clever in school. He was one of these 10 A-star students, but copped out. Went to Jordanstown, dropped out after starting a degree in architecture. He was one of these guys didn't have to study, it just came naturally to him. He's filled with brains. And after he left Jordanstown, him and his good friend on Independence Day in 1979, July 1979, him and his good friend Desi Collins took themselves off to America for a 2-week holiday. None of the two of them were seen again for 18 months. When Desi went to jail, Desi's a prisoner of war, ex-prisoner of war. When Desi went to jail, James was the one who fussed and made a big deal out of Desi's parcels being filled twice a week, every week, with everything that Desi needed. We will never forget that. So off the two of them went to the States and were never seen again. And on his return, then again the party started, and we had great times through the 80s. In 1989, James and I hooked up together and we bought this building and we opened the 7-Eleven. We borrowed the name of the shop from a huge corporation in America who had thousands of 7-Elevens. And James loved it 6 months after we opened the shop to get a letter from the London solicitors of the 7-Eleven company based in New York complaining that we had copied their signage. James framed the letter, wrote back to the solicitors in London and told them they were very welcome to come along to the Falls Road and take the sign down. We were also one of the first ones to put words up around their 7-Eleven in Asgaelga. We were so proud of our language. And we put the signage up in Irish. The shop was a success to the point where all James cared about was making friends, not making money. So we didn't have knitting needles. He'd have phoned me up and said, we need to get knitting needles in. And I would say, James, I don't think we're going to be asked for those again. No matter what we were asked for, if we didn't have it, he went fanatical to go and fetch it somewhere. I used to complain to him when a queue formed in the shop, will you stop nattering to the customers? We're not getting anybody served. He'd have walked out with them into their car and no work was getting done. We then progressed and opened a hairdressing salon upstairs. And one of the arguments James and I had was over the name of this new hairdressing salon. We drew up a list of 10 names. And he said to me, which one do you think belongs to the bottom? And I said, Foxy's. And he says, no, Foxy's belongs to the top. And we called this shop Foxy's. And I said to him, it won't last 3 weeks. It lasted a number of years and became widely known all over the city. He also worked in DeLorean for a while shortly before we opened the 7-Eleven and became great friends with John DeLorean. That didn't surprise any of us. So moving on to the circumstances of James' murder. That morning, a loyalist murder gang turned up here, sent by unknowns. Someone decided somewhere that James would be murdered that day. Someone in Whitehall or someone in Lisnashara Barrack made that decision. Young loyalists came in here, shot James dead. His body lay for 7 hours, even though Patsy, his mother, immediately after his death, because James was a blood and organ donor, his mother asked that his organs be donated to help others. The coroner at the inquest commented that it was a disgrace because of the amount of hours that passed that his organs could not be used to help others. This was because the RUC, then co-conspirators in that murder, treated the family with disdain and disrespect. James's body, and it was on television that evening, James's body was carried out of that door in a body bag with his face lying half out of the body bag, and he was tossed into the back of a van for all to see. Some of the gutter Sunday newspapers picked up on that film and put a clip of his face in one of the gutter Sunday newspapers. There was no proper investigation. We came into the shop afterwards and found bullet rounds in the wall. The RUC made no attempt to investigate properly. So as I said, 30 years ago, someone decided to end James' life. He was targeted because he was from our community. And 30 years later, his family and friends have no answers as to why he was murdered and by whom. The inquest into his death was a travesty, leaving his family further traumatised, with his brother Ed describing it as a shambolic event in which the family were made to feel like dirt. They are still suffering the pain today, still feeling angry and hurt. The pain of losing James in such violent circumstances was truly horrific, and their treatment by the coronial system at that time added to their distress. The former Lord Chief Justice Declan Morgan laid out a 5-year plan to address the backlog of legacy inquests, promising to deliver justice to the families like James, and in May we saw how the Ballymurphy families finally had their day when their relatives were vindicated. So now the British government want to change the law to protect the guilty. The British government planned to introduce an amnesty for its soldiers and its agents who murdered our friends and neighbours like James. The British government planned to stop all legacy inquests and civil actions in the case of legacy murders. The British government planned to put a stay on all current and future inquests. Bernadette Devlin once said, when we break the law, we go to jail. When the British government, breaks the law, it changes it. We are now seeing that at first hand. So we are here today not just to commemorate James, but to send our own message. James is not forgotten. James will never be forgotten. And we, his family and friends, stand beside all the other families who fight for justice and truth. His long suffering family deserve nothing less. He is still loved by us all, and he is still present in all we do. And as his friend, I miss him every day of my life. Gormila Mayogad, everybody.